Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Recently, I did the Victorian Literature Journey tag, and I found myself gushing about Jane Eyre, a book I have loved since I was a fairly young girl. I mentioned in passing that I have never forgiven Charlotte Bronte's sister Emily for writing a book not exactly like Jane Eyre. Yes, I appreciate Wuthering Heights in a lot of ways now, but it will never be a favorite. And in that video, I also mentioned that I was planning to read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte as part of my Victober celebrations for the very first time. Let me say up front that I have known about Anne Bronte's book for a long time, and I knew many of its plot points. I don't have any issues at all with so-called spoilers, which I know is not true for many of you. And although I usually try to steer away from talking about plot points from the ends of novels, I'm going to violate my practice a bit today. I'll keep the spoilers very general. And honestly, if you haven't read Tenant, but have read a fair bit of Victorian literature in general, you will absolutely assume that all the things I'm going to talk about will be part of the plot. Still, consider yourself warned. When I picked this up, I thought it might be a much better fit for me than Wuthering Heights, since it has something of a reputation for being much more like Jane Eyre. It also has a reputation for being a feminist novel. In fact, a fair number of people say that while Jane Eyre has proto-feminist moments, that Tenant might be the first truly feminist novel published in English. I'll get to my own view on this claim a bit later on in this video, but first I want to compare Anne's The Tenant of Wildfell Hall to Charlotte's Jane Eyre. To begin with, there are quite a number of similarities in the plots. I'm not at all suggesting that Anne copied Charlotte. Some of these plot lines were probably pretty common in the literature of the time, and some might even be common now. And perhaps they were both writing in response to things they had experienced in their home lives. Just to name a few. Most centrally, both books have heroines fighting for independence after being mistreated, and gaining a certain kind of independence. But then, in the end, both Jane and Helen face a, quote, successful resolution of the standard marriage plot. Both books have the heroines taking care of the people they hated most and who had mistreated them, taking care of them as they faced death, and both women are asked by the villains to essentially forgive them, sort of. Interestingly, both novels have the heroine's other potential mate dead at the end of the novel. And both Helen and Jane go from barely making ends meet on their own to inheriting large amounts from their uncles. While there are all these similarities, there are also some pretty significant differences as well, things that go far beyond plot. The one that struck me first is that, in my opinion, Anne Bronte is a fairly plain and prosaic writer. She doesn't seem to have the same command of language to the degree that her sister Charlotte does. Jane Eyre is full of gorgeous imagery and beautiful sentences, and I see very little of that in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. Initially, I thought Anne was just an inferior writer, unable to fill the pages with the kind of atmosphere and emotional response that imagery and writing can help create. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the sisters were really writing in totally different registers. Charlotte and her sister Emily were essentially romantics, and Anne was writing more as a realist. That is, there's nothing magical, nothing dramatic on a major scale, nothing larger than life. Unlike Jane and Rochester, Helen and Gilbert have no supernatural bond, for example. There is no in the as one spoiler-free discussion named the most famous plot twist in Jane Eyre. Instead, realist authors like Anne Bronte tried to express how the everyday world actually worked. I mean, the stories are just as much fictional as the romantic novels were, but the settings and the events mirrored real life, at least in most ways. After I started thinking about this distinction, I searched online to confirm what I thought. and to find out a little more about Victorian realism specifically. I found a fascinating short discussion on the wonderful podcast of a BBC show, In Our Time, between Philip Davis, A.N. Wilson, and Dinah Birch. I'll leave a link to it down below. One of the things I found most fascinating was the comment that literary realism was doing the same thing that the camera was doing to visual arts, and that the microscope was doing to science. All of these developments were happening when British society was undergoing the massive changes of both urbanization and industrialization. One of the interviewees suggested that realist authors were not merely trying to reflect people's lives at this moment when so many people felt unsure and adrift. The authors were trying to change people's lives, to portray the fault lines in the society they lived in, not the suffering that might happen to specific hypothetical individuals, but the kind of suffering that happened to whole groups of people. What some of the realist authors were doing was putting forth calls to action. And of course, that is what I think Anne Bronte was trying to do in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. She was calling the public's attention to the issues of alcoholism and spousal abuse, and she was calling for moral reform. It's incredibly tempting, I think, for us to look back at previous generations and try to see links between the culture of that time and the culture of our time, to see how some forward thinkers might have felt just as we do. And of course, there really are those links sometimes. But sometimes I think we take certain features of a work, think about it outside of its context, and overlook what else is going on. My feeling is that that is what is happening when modern readers call The Tenant of Wildfell Hall a feminist work. Is Anne Bronte trying to point out how cruel it is to have women be so powerless against husbands who abuse them? Yes, absolutely. But was she motivated by an ideology that women are equal to men politically, economically, and socially? No. What she wanted was for men not to be raised in a culture that encouraged heavy drinking and cultural violence among men because it hurt women who had so few ways to defend themselves legally. And she wanted women to have the ability to escape from profound mistreatment like that. That is definitely a desire for social reform. But it just isn't feminism per se. Did the various movements for social reform more broadly encourage the development of feminism? Absolutely. But those previous steps, based not on ideas of equality, but rather on compassion for those who've been hurt by sexism and misogyny, is not yet feminism itself. Let's look at a couple of specific moments from The Tenant of Wildfell Hall to highlight the differences. Fundamentally, Helen is expressing not political, but religious ideas. She's concerned about morality, and she believes she, with the deep sense of morality she seems to think women come by naturally, can reform the men in her life. She marries her first husband, fully knowing that he needs what she thinks of as moral guidance. She does, in the course of the long book, have a couple of moments of very limited success in her efforts to change her husband's ways. And here's how she talks about that success. At present, I am pleased with Arthur. He has not positively disgraced himself upwards of a fortnight. Is this supposed to be funny? Maybe it is, but I'm afraid it makes Helen seem like a moralizing scold rather than someone committed to liberation or to mutual respect. But she soon realizes that no matter how she tries to help him follow moral law, that is, in her case, Christian law as understood at the time by some people, she cannot reform her husband for the long term. And after the abuse continues, and continues some more, Helen takes her son and leaves. Does she leave because she feels he is deeply unfair to her? No, she leaves because she fears that her husband might corrupt their son and potentially corrupt her. She leaves because of her sense of duty to her son and to her faith. And she leaves because the man has not lived up to his duty to take care of her and her son. Even after her experience of failing at reforming the first abusive man she chose as a partner, she totally embraces the idea of reforming the next man in her life. Indeed, reform seems to be the expectation for what women do, or at least what Helen wants to do. And while that second man might seem less objectionable than the first, we've already seen the second man nearly kill another man, beat him until it was unclear whether he would live or die because he thought that man was having an affair with Helen. He was insanely jealous, even though he and Helen weren't even committed to each other in any way at that point. Fairly near the end of the novel, Helen finds out that her husband, the alcoholic abuser, is dying alone. And again, she's acting out of a profound sense of her duty to him, perhaps partly because she is still his legal wife, but also because she sees it as her moral duty. Of course, this reinforces the idea that Anne Bronte is primarily interested in moral reform rather than women's liberation. Let me make it very clear that while I love feminist books and proto-feminist books, I in no way require feminist ideology to be present in all the books I read, especially if they're written in a previous era. But because I had heard so much about how feminist this particular book was, I found myself quite disappointed. Before I end on this very negative note, let me mention a section I found much more interesting. When Helen goes to nurse her husband on his deathbed, Anne Bronte describes the experience in quite a bit of detail. Prayer and salvation are certainly at the core of much of the discussion, but I was kind of amazed at how much Bronte talks about caregiving for a person going through the process of a fairly prolonged dying process. She also explicitly talks about the importance for terminally ill people to acknowledge what is happening, so they can say what they think needs to be said to their loved ones, but also, at least for Helen, to God. Even though I've read a ton of 21st century books about dying people, both fiction and memoir, I almost never see accounts of deathbed scenes that are this drawn out and realistic, at least in a sense. I think I appreciate what Bronte was doing here a lot more right now than I would have before. Well, I didn't intend to end on what may feel a little morbid to some of you. My apologies. To get back to the more central question here, I know many of you have radically different impressions of this book from the one I just articulated, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it down below in the comments. Thank you very much to all of you for watching this video. See you soon here on Hannah's Books.